So what the agenda we put today is a high-level overview of the Essential 8. And this is not going to be a deep dive into each of the strategies. It will basically be a high-level overview, which will go over the 8 controls and how businesses can sort of leverage the security controls to increase their security posture and improve their maturity. So we'll start by discussing what the Essential 8 is. The Essential 8 was developed by the Australian Cybersecurity Centre with the aim to improve cyber resilience for Australian businesses. And they do that through the objective of preventing attacks, limiting the impact of successful attacks, and ensuring that you have data availability. The Essential 8 is based on a maturity model, and that maturity model goes from 0 to 3. We won't talk about maturity level 0, which basically means there's no protections or controls in place. So we talk about maturities level 1, which means your organization is partly aligned with the strategies and with the Essential 8, to level 3, which means you're fully aligned. And because it's based on a maturity model, it means that there's no one size fits all for your organization. Each organization will need to assess their risk, what's the likelihood of being targeted by adversaries, and look at each one of the controls and see which is the most appropriate maturity level for you. So of the first controls, we will look at application control or whitelisting. What this is essentially preventing the execution of malicious code from unauthorized or insecure applications. And it does this through whitelisting applications that are approved by your organization. So what this means is instead of blacklisting, which you choose the applications you don't want to run, you are basically only allowing authorized applications that you trust. Now, why is this? Why would we want to implement application control? Well, in 2020, 59% of malware came from executables, which is the preferred file type from web applications. And basically, attackers will basically use this malware and use this to basically execute malicious code within systems. So by implementing application control, you can decrease your risk of malware being installed, because it won't be allowed to run because it won't be authorized. So the important to realize what application control is not, and that is a replacement of your antivirus. What the Essential 8 advises is that this is a minimum baseline for your security posture, and it should be used in conjunction with other security measures to ensure an appropriate security strategy for your organization. So it's not a replacement for antivirus. It's not a way for you to install applications. It is not a web or content filter, and it is not a way to verify applications, but it is a way to control what is being installed on your network. If you're going to implement application control, this is probably the one that's going to require the most planning and review and communication within your organization. And the reason I say that is because people are used to being able to work the way they want, when they want, using the tools that they want. Implementing application control means you'll be taking some of that away from them. And if that is not properly communicated and controlled, then you may not have user adoption, which is key. So it is going to be a cultural shift. And when you look at the statistics, which shows on average 70 plus applications are installed across organizations, it's not surprising that this will cause disruption. So it has to be planned and in coordination with key stakeholders. Of the next control measures is application patching. And applications are created by humans. They make mistakes, and in their code, there's vulnerabilities, there's flaws, and attackers will look to exploit any vulnerability in applications to be able to execute malicious code, gain access to your systems or to your data. And why is that important? Well, if we look at once a vulnerability in an application is made public, on average, it takes 48 hours to develop malicious code that can be used to exploit those systems. The screenshot that you see below is actually an email we received from the Joint Cybersecurity Centre on Tuesday, advising that there was a known vulnerability in Fortinet routers across our client sites, or across Fortinet devices in total. So we have several clients using these devices, and it basically advised that through this vulnerability, the attackers could create a denial of service attack. So taking that information, we made sure that all those devices were patched quite quickly, just to ensure that this type of attack could not take place across our customer base. Now, the recommendations from the ACSC for Essential 8 is that depending on the type of threats to experience, this is how often you should be updating your applications. So if we look at internet-facing services or basic cybersecurity threats, you're looking at 2 weeks or 48 hours if an exploit is known, and you probably commonly target applications, you want to be updating them every month. Obviously, as that becomes more advanced and more critical, you want to be patching and updating those applications more often. The other measure that we have is the Microsoft Office macro settings. So what a macro is it's a way for you to automate repetitive tasks across the Office applications. To give an example would be Excel. You may have a report that you generate once a month or quite regularly where you need to tidy that data up. It comes in a CSV format. You may need to rename the columns, change some of the data fields. And this, depending on the size of your workbook or your file, may take a bit of time and require quite a lot of repetitive steps. Through the use of macros, you can automate that entire process, which increases your productivity and allows you the next time to, at a click of a button, do all those tasks quite easily. The risk of that, of course, is attackers can take advantage of macros. They can deploy macros to Office applications, which will allow them to run malicious code, gain access to your systems, or execute commands. So there is a balance between productivity and reducing risk. So this is where the ACSC really wants you to identify what is the business case for allowing macros within your organization. Now, you may not even have the requirement, so it's best to disable them altogether, but you may find that there are several users that require them to work on their day-to-day. So the other thing to consider is the macros that are used and deployed across your Office applications. Do they come from a trusted developer or trusted party? Now, Microsoft does have a list of trusted developers that they publish quite often. And then the macros that you're using, have they been validated and by a trustworthy and a technically skilled third party? And are they separate to the developer themselves? I think that is key. So if you were to look at what controls we can put in place, let's just say reach a level 2 maturity with the Essential 8, and when it comes to macros, these are the controls. So for example, Microsoft Office macro antivirus scanning is enabled, and you disable macros for anyone that does not actually need them within your organization. Now, the ACSC for level 3 really says that all macros should be disabled, but that's not always the case for your organization. User application hardening, how does this differ from application control? Well, once you've identified the applications that should be installed on your network, you need to ensure that the applications that are being installed, one, are developed by companies using secure by design principles. That means that they are developed often, they are updated often, and they have security practices in place. But also, by default, applications in their default state are less secure and susceptible to exploitation. And that's what attackers will look for. For example, one of the controls to reach maturity level 2 is to disable the option for users to be able to change the Microsoft Office security settings. That can be done by group policy or via other ways, but this is just one of the steps to ensure that the applications that you are allowing are even more secure. We then move on to restricting administrative privileges, and this is aimed at reducing the number of users across your organization that have elevated privileges. Now, that can be within your domain, that can be across Microsoft 365. But what's important is that attackers will target these accounts, and they are actually one of the highest targeted types because of the way their elevated privileges have access to your data and your systems. So by mitigating the number of devices or accounts that you have across your organization that do have elevated privileges will help mitigate that risk to some extent. And it will also reduce the risk that in the event that someone with elevated privileges executes malware inadvertently on their machine, that the executed malware does not elevate its privileges and spread across other hosts. Obviously, the more people you have, the greater that risk is. So what are some of the controls that we can put in place? Well, as a baseline to achieve level 1, you want to ensure that anyone that requests privileged access to systems is validated, and that should be validated upon request, but it also should be validated quite often. We also recommend maintaining a permissions matrix. Now, you can use this through software or through any means, but it really requires you to validate and identify all the users who have elevated privileges across all of your applications and systems. They also recommend for one of the controls that credentials for local administrator accounts and service accounts are long, unique, and unpredictable. I'd even go so further to say that every single user account should take this stance. That's across your personal accounts as well. With password managers like Keeper and LastPass, it makes it easier now to store your passwords securely, randomized, and unique. And then one of the last control measures you want to be putting in place is to say privileged access is disabled by default after 45 days of inactivity on accounts. Moving on, we'll have a look at patching operating systems. Now, much like application patching, operating systems themselves are known to flaws, vulnerabilities, and they are exploited. And so if there is a vulnerability, then attackers will do everything they can to exploit that. Now, like one of the risks that we sort of see is, and you'll see it all the time with Windows updating quite often, is because it's either updating and fixing a bug or it's doing a feature update, but most of the time it is trying to patch those security vulnerabilities. Operating systems that are end of life no longer receive those updates. So if we look at Windows 7, for example, in January 2020, basically Microsoft stopped all support for Windows 7, and that means the support as well as the patching of security updates. So if there are known vulnerabilities within Windows 7, which there are, then attackers will look to exploit that. So if you are running Windows 7 on any of your devices across your networks, then it is our recommendation that those machines are either upgraded or they are replaced. So when you sort of look at the controls that the ACSC recommend, they recommend standardizing on a trusted vendor, Windows being the most trusted in the world and obviously the most heavily used for businesses. It also recommends creating a standard operating environment, not running an environment mixed with Windows 7, Windows 10 and 11. And obviously, as we mentioned before, you want to upgrade all of your operating systems if they are end of life. Also, you want to patch and install updates regularly. That is key. Now, as we mentioned, this is a minimum baseline Essential 8 for what you should be using. It is not a replacement of security measures such as antivirus. So Essential 8 needs to be implemented in conjunction with additional security measures dependent on your, risk posture and your risk assessment. And then looking at which Essential 8 controls is the most appropriate for your organization and patching your operating systems according to that maturity level. Moving on to multi-factor authentication. This is probably the most effective control you can use today to prevent unauthorized access to your systems. What multi-factor authentication is something either a password or a passphrase, in combination with something you have like a physical token, a code from an authenticator app, or something you are, so fingerprint, your facial recognition, or an iris scan. Now, why is this important? Well, when implemented correctly, multi-factor authentication can make it significantly more difficult for adversaries to steal legitimate credentials. Basically, to give you an example, MyFitnessPal in 2017 was compromised, and they dumped about 140 million records onto the internet, and that was users' email and password combination. Attackers will buy that information and will have a look at the password and the username that you use. And like most people, myself at the time, used that same combination of password and username across multiple online accounts such as Instagram, Facebook, and so on. So what they do is that even though those other systems might be secure, they've taken the username and password that they've gained and then have tried to apply it to multiple accounts. If there is no form of protection and your password is compromised, then they can gain access to your systems. And hence why what we implement as a standard and enforced across, say, Microsoft 365 tenants, as a standard, multi-factor authentication needs to be enabled. And that is just a baseline measure. And obviously, passwords are not secure, even if they are randomized and unique. If they are compromised, you do want that additional security measure. And if you look at the security, I guess the levels and the maturity levels with Essential 8, you will see that multi-factor authentication, even at level 1, is required for all internet-facing services, as well as third-party internet-facing services. So if you're using applications such as Xero, if you're using Microsoft 365, you want to be ensuring that multi-factor authentication is enabled for those systems. One that's not listed here that we actually are probably going to start looking to implement is the use of VPN or MFA on VPN. The reason for that is VPN is more of a multi-step authentication method and not multi-factor. So with multi-step, attackers can still compromise. If they can compromise one layer, they can then move on to compromise the next step in the authentication chain. So by having MFA on your VPNs, you're securing your internal data systems even more. And then on the final point with the Essential 8, and probably one that doesn't need much introduction or explanation, is around backups. And this has been a long-standing, reliable strategy to safeguard you from, I guess, unintentional or malicious threats. To give you an example, Glyn backup services that we use will pretty much get most of our clients to a maturity level 3. And that is because if we implement backups using Veeam, which we do, which is encrypted, secure, using accounts that are not shared, but also that are airtight and backed off to a remote location, we already basically adhere to a level 3 maturity level. Our recommendation is that for backups across all organizations that you should be aiming for a level 3 maturity. And the ACSC actually recommends all Australian businesses reach level 3, which is not always practical, especially for small businesses. So we would recommend for some of these controls, start with level 1, but at least for MFA and for regular backups, you do want to be aiming for a level 3 maturity level. Additionally, what it means is that in the event, and this is that last stage when we look at the prevention and the data availability. So backups is that if you have been compromised, if you've had an accidental deletion or a malicious attack such as ransomware, you do have the ability to recover. And that's why we recommend backing up regularly. And if your business is dependent on your data and your systems, either financially or to ensure business continuity, then we recommend backing up quite often, once an hour at least, and that they're encrypted and they are definitely kept off site in an airtight container. So that's all of the Essential 8 controls. Very high level overview. And probably the next question that you want to ask is, where do you go from here? And how do you go about implementing Essential 8? So for us, we recommend knowing your current baseline, and that can be done through an Essential 8 audit. You need to know where you are at the moment in terms of your security posture. It does also require that you assess your level of risk, and we recommend creating a risk committee. And that is not, while you might be able to leverage services like, say, from Linden Tech, internally that security culture needs to be driven. So you need to have key stakeholders such as HR who will drive your user awareness training and the onboarding to really drive that culture of security and ensure that people are aware of the threats. But also if you're in the executive team at the moment, or if you're on the C-suite, or if you are on the board of directors, risks does not reside with IT, it resides with you. And you need to be driving adoption of security. So understanding the threats that are out there for your organization is absolutely key. And then you need to identify what is the maturity level you want to look for. Now, it's important to note that you do not want to apply this all at once, and we definitely don't recommend it, and don't get fixated on one particular maturity level. So, for example, if you want to aim for a level 3 in backups, that does not need to mean that you need to have a level 3 in application control, because that just may not be appropriate or feasible for yourselves. So at each of the strategies, you need to have a look at which maturity level is appropriate, and then based on your risk, you need to create a baseline. We would probably recommend that you would want to be aiming for at least level 2 for most of the controls. But again, depending on the risk and your risk posture and your risk appetite, that may change. Obviously, we also recommend working with a partner to implement these strategies, because while you may be able to drive adoption, you will need technically minded people who can leverage the tools out there and implement some of these changes across your network, which is usually going to be IT. And I mentioned it before with application control, it is key to communicate and collaborate with the affected stakeholders within your organization to drive that adoption. If you don't bring them on that journey, any change initiative is going to fail. And obviously, application control is probably going to be the one that's affected the most or will impact users the most. But if they can understand why, and if you've involved them in that process, then you're going to see greater user adoption. And again, finally, you just need to create a culture of security. It's going to get worse. There's going to be attacks are going to become more and more prevalent. So everyone just needs to be, implement due diligence. And by creating that culture, you'll definitely achieve that. All right. So that brings us to the end of our of the Essential 8. So we'll now move on to some Q&As. Does the ACS provide a list of approved products for implementing Essential 8? No, this one's definitely they definitely don't, because they don't want to align themselves with a particular technology. And the reason for that is there's various products out there, but you probably want to talk to someone like Glyn or have a look yourself as to which ones you can. For application control, Microsoft themselves actually has some really good tools natively there that you can use, or something like Threat Locker, which we've used in the past, which will allow you to do that auditing in that. All right, we've got a few more. Is the use of Essential 8 a requirement in Australia, or are there any other frameworks that could be considered? While it's not a requirement for Australian businesses, I believe that it will be, not into the near future. So there are 98 non-government, Commonwealth non-government entities out there that this is being made mandated and mandatory. So they will need to implement Essential 8 at a bare minimum, and they will have to, every 5 years, will have to have an audit to ensure that they comply with all the 8 control mechanisms in place. Yes, there are other frameworks out there, such as ISO and NIST. And I think it's important to remember that Essential 8 is the baseline, and it's a really good starting point for organizations. While it is a mitigating strategy, it does not dive into depth as to how you would, identify the threats and the risk. Using something like NIST is actually a more comprehensive, and a lot of the control mechanisms actually come from NIST. So NIST will go over everything from identifying to protecting to detecting, and then how do you go about recovering and responding from security events. I've got another question of how do we start our Essential 8 journey. Obviously, we mentioned before at the end of the slides, we would recommend engaging with someone like Glyn, who would do an Essential 8 audit, identify your baseline as to where you are, and then have meetings with you to identify where you want to go to, what maturity level you want to achieve, and then we put together a roadmap of how you can achieve this. Now, it is something that is a partnership. It's not going to be, it can't be driven completely by, say, someone like Glyn or a security team. You will need to be involved, and that process of implementing it will require a lot of communication and back and forth with yourselves. All right. Are there any other questions? Just checking here. Here's one. Do I have to implement all the strategies at once? No, I think I answered this one before, but definitely not. And we definitely do not recommend implementing them all in one hit. My recommendation would be to look at your backups, multi-factor authentication, and your patching as probably your main ones to start with. Multi-factor authentication is that low-hanging fruit, which most applications and services today provide. But I definitely would be looking to look at those first, and then starting to build a roadmap of implementing the other controls. Again, like I mentioned with application control, that will take some time, and that one will probably not something you want to start off with about. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, let's finish a little short today, but if at any time you do have any more questions, or you want to discuss with Tech how Essential can, I guess, be leveraged in your organization, feel free to reach out to us at any time, send us an email, give me a call. I'm always happy to have a chat. And there will be a recording that's available after this webinar if you wanted to go over the content again. And we're going to be uploading it to our YouTube channel. So they'll be coming in the coming days. All right. Thanks everyone for your time, and have a great day.